Hello there, I'm Sarah, your natural endometriosis expert. Welcome to my podcast. This is the place to be for information, advice and tips on managing your endometriosis naturally. I've been managing my own endo now successfully for about 20 years, and I've been running my own therapy business since 2008, helping others to do the same. If you're curious to cut through all the noise and rubbish that's out there and learn the key to managing endometriosis with minimal reliance on drugs and surgery, then this is the only podcast you'll need. Let's get started. Hello there. So today we are going to talk about exactly what is endometriosis. The main thing to say, first of all, is endometriosis manifests very, very differently from person to person. So the first thing to say here is not to get worried or concerned or dismissive if you have Googled endometriosis, if doctors have told you about endometriosis and you don't think that you have the symptoms. Not everybody has all of the symptoms that are listed as usual symptoms, and some people have completely different symptoms as well. Some people just have one or two, some people have a whole tick list. Endometriosis may feel very, very different to you than it does to other people with endo. So don't get too hung up if you feel that you haven't got endo, because there are different types of endo, which we'll go into. And like I say, it manifests very, very differently depending on pain thresholds, depending on levels of endometriosis. It can feel very different. Essentially, endometriosis is where tissue that is very, very similar to the inside of the womb grows outside of the womb. So every person with a uterus has a lining within that uterus that every month, if in a healthy cycle, every month this tissue sort of plumps itself up, gets ready for implantation. If implantation doesn't occur, then the tissue is shed, and it's shed in the form of menstrual bleeding. So that is your monthly period. When this tissue or tissue, like the tissue that's found inside the uterus, grows external to the uterus, it acts in the same way. So essentially it's plumping itself up at different parts of the cycle and then trying to shed. So that is essentially what endometriosis is. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's essentially what endometriosis is. It's incredibly common. There are 10% of women in the UK, so 1.5 million women in the UK are diagnosed with endo. It takes on average 8 years for a diagnosis of endo, so there are hundreds of thousands of women living with endometriosis but without a diagnosis. Some people don't have any symptoms at all as well, so you can have silent endometriosis, which means there are a whole host of other women out there that have endo and have no idea they have endo. We also have misdiagnoses as well, so it's very common to be misdiagnosed with things like polycystic ovaries or IBS when actually you have endometriosis. So I don't think I'm going out on too much of a limb to say that 1.5 million women with endometriosis is a massive underestimation. So it's very common. For such a common condition, there's not a great deal known about it. So this podcast, we're going to look very, very briefly at what it is and some of the symptoms around it, but we'll be talking more about certain symptoms or specific symptoms in later episodes as well. So essentially, this tissue, this womb lining type tissue, grows outside of the womb. Most commonly, it's found in the abdomen. So normally it doesn't travel too far. It sits kind of within the area where the womb sits. So you can find it in the soft tissue, in the connective tissue that's down there, that's connecting everything else. You can find endometrial deposits in there. You can find it attached to the bladder, attached to the bowel. Sometimes it travels even further, so you can have it, I've had it on my hip, you can have it travelling up, so diaphragmatic endometriosis is a thing, you can get it within your diaphragm. I've worked with people with it on their eyelids, toenails. It can grow anywhere. Western medicine can't really give us an answer as to why that is, but I always think everything's connected, so it's almost like if you think of your body as a landmass and your blood circulation system and everything as rivers and subsidiaries, then it can sort of travel in the same way that we travel around, the tissue can travel around. So it's not really a great surprise that if it can grow one place, it can grow many places. So I don't think really there's any limit as to where this endometrial tissue grows. And like I say, it acts in a very similar way to how the lining inside the uterus reacts. It plumps up, it tries to shed, which is what's causing a lot of the pain and the inflammation that we feel with endometriosis. With endo, we also get scarring. So we don't just get the adhesions, we get scarring. If you think about when you cut your finger and the tissue starts to reconnect and it forms a scab, that's kind of the same thing that's happening in your abdomen with endometriosis. So just by moving, so quite often we feel the movements very acutely, with acute pain when we're moving in and around our abdomen or wherever we have the endo. And that's because the tissue is in effect tearing apart, like a scab on your finger. When you bend your finger a little bit too far, that's essentially what's happening in your tummy. So you've got this mass that's sitting there quite happily, kind of connecting tissue in the same way that a scab does, and then you're in effect ripping that scab. And that sounds pretty horrific, and that's why you're getting the horrific pain, because you're kind of opening that scab up, almost like creating a wound in there. The other thing that we get is cysts as well. So unlike normal cysts, everybody who ovulates will have cysts at some point, and that's perfectly natural, perfectly healthy. Essentially what can happen in a normal cycle, in a healthy cycle, is that the egg's produced, but essentially it's not released. And when the egg isn't released, the follicle turns into a cyst. And then normally after the next cycle, that cyst will just wither and die naturally, and just be passed in the next bleed. So cysts aren't uncommon, cysts aren't unhealthy, but with endometriosis, the cysts that we get are slightly different because they are filled with this endometrial type tissue. So the tissue that's growing external to the womb fills the cysts. So you will hear of them referred to sometimes as chocolate cysts, and that's because they're brown in colour. Now, sorry to get too graphic if you're eating or if you're just a little bit squeamish, but quite often one of the main symptoms with endometriosis is part of the menstrual bleed will be like a brownish chocolatey type colour. So that's the same stuff that's filling these cysts. So when you get endometriosis, you get these endometriomas cysts, which are like a chocolate colour cyst, which is just basically, in inverted commas, normal cyst filled with the endometrial type tissue. They don't wither and die in the same way as a normal cyst, a simple cyst does. They kind of stick with us, and they can even grow as well. So I've heard some cases of sort of 6-7 centimetre wide, if not bigger. I've heard of a lot bigger, but I've worked with cases of 6-7 centimetre size cysts very, very commonly in the abdomen. And really the only way of getting that is to getting rid of them is to drain them. There are different techniques you can use, but again, that's for a different podcast. But the most effective way is to get them drained. You might not need to if they're not causing any problems. If you're not trying to get pregnant, then they might not be too much of an issue. You might be able to live with them. Some people have them and never even know they've got them. But if they are causing issues, if you want to get rid of them, that's normally the best way. But again, I'm getting sidetracked. So we have endometrial deposits. I have adhesions and lesions of this endometriosis type deposit or endometriosis deposits in our abdomen, in our diaphragm, up in our shoulder, wherever in the body it's travelled to, and that is what causes the pain. And then we have cysts as well. Now, there is different grading, there are different types of endometriosis. Depending where in the world you're listening to this podcast, the grading could be slightly different. So I'm not going to get too hung up on the grading. And to be honest, I don't actually agree with the grading system anyway, because it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't. You can be in the UK, you can be stage 1 endometriosis and have an incredible amount of pain and other symptoms, and it can be so debilitating. You can have stage 4 endometriosis and not really have too much of a problem with it. So it doesn't really correlate to the severity of the endometriosis you have. It's kind of more of a medical way of looking at it. It looks at the medical side of it rather than the impact of the person, if that makes sense. So in the UK, we grade and I think in America and Australia as well, we grade our endometriosis based on how deeply infiltrating it is. So you can have superficial, and again, that's kind of not the right word, because even with this, in quotes, superficial endometriosis, you can get a lot of debilitating symptoms. But superficial endometriosis essentially means that it's kind of surface level. It hasn't travelled too far deep into the body. So it's maybe a few small lesions or bigger lesions, but a few dotted around rather than creating major havoc in the body. It means that there isn't that much scar tissue. So if you go back to the analogy about the scab, it's kind of like a fresh scab or a scab that's healed. and there's possibly a little bit of residual stuff there, but there's nothing major going on. There's just a few dots around here and around the abdomen, and it hasn't really travelled that far outside the abdomen either. And then on a sliding scale, we then at the early stage, so at the first stage, it's not even the first stage because it's not necessarily a progressive illness either. So to say first and second kind of gives it an indication that if you start at number 1, it's going to progress, which that isn't necessarily the case. But yeah, at that kind of light, endometriosis light, you don't really have a lot of cysts. You might get an occasional cyst, but there's not too much of a thing going on in your body. It's confined predominantly to the abdomen with a few light patches of endo and every now and again maybe an occasional cyst. And that then goes right the way through to very, very deeply infiltrating endometriosis. So this is where you've got so much endometriosis in your abdomen that it hasn't just attached to the bowel, it hasn't just attached to the bladder, but actually they have kind of fused together. So what's essentially happened is you've got all of this. Imagine if you'd kind of, this is a really bad analogy because I don't know anybody that this has ever happened to, but imagine if you've cut your 2 fingers on the sort of the mirror side of each other. They start to scab over, and they scab over in a way that actually links the fingers together. So the fingers can't move independently of each other. The scar tissue has connected those 2 fingers together. That's essentially what happens with deeply infiltrating endometriosis. So you get all of the tissue in effect becomes hardened. It becomes like scar tissues, and it fuses all the organs together in your abdomen. That is really uncommon. It's not really uncommon, but it's the least common endometriosis, and that's again, that's kind of what we'd refer to in the UK as stage 4. There's a lot of cysts. There's a lot of in Chinese medicine, that's what we'd call stagnation and toxicity. There's a lot of stuff going on in your abdomen. And that is as well where we find a lot of the endometriosis has travelled quite a lot further than just within the abdomen. So that's where you start to see more severe cases of the endometriosis materialising in the abdomen and in different places. In the diaphragm and in different places. So people very, very often refer to getting almost like asthmatic symptoms at certain times of the cycle or throughout the cycle. So again, that's potentially diaphragmatic. So if you have a diagnosis of endometriosis and you do notice yourself getting a little bit breathless, that could be a sign that the endometriosis is sort of present in your diaphragm. And it's not necessarily anything to worry about. If you are worried about anything in this podcast or anything in any of the podcasts, do of course speak to your GP, to your specialist, or have a chat with someone like me who can maybe advise. But we'd always advise speaking to your Western medicine professionals if you are concerned. So that's kind of an overview of endometriosis. The symptoms that you get with endo, like I say, we'll delve into a lot more detail in future podcasts, but that's kind of what endometriosis is. The things I'd say are not to worry if you have it. There are a lot of scare stories on Google. Dr. Google is a scary person to consult with. By all means, research endometriosis. By all means, read up about it, but try not to get too sucked into all the scare stories that you hear on the internet and on certain social media groups and pages and things. It's not necessarily as scary and as it may appear to be, and there are things that you can do to alleviate your symptoms, to really get to the cause of your endo and make your life a heck of a lot better. But again, we will be looking at those in future podcasts. Don't believe the hype, don't believe the myths. There are a lot of scary myths out there around endo, and that really doesn't help when you're diagnosed with endometriosis. But that is essentially what endo is. Endo impacts on so many women, not exactly the same, but around the same number of women have diagnosis of endometriosis as they do diabetes. So that's how common it is. Yet a lot of people have never heard of it. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into what it is. If you have any more questions, then please do get in touch, and we will be looking at, like I say, the symptoms and some remedies and other myths and things around endo in future podcasts. Enjoy. In the meantime, stay safe, stay happy, stay cool. thank you so much for tuning in today. I really hope that you found this podcast helpful. If you did, please hit follow so you can listen to more, and please also share it with anyone else who you think will benefit. And don't forget, if you're looking for women's health treatments, workshops or support within your workplace, you can find all of my services, including our monthly virtual clinic, over at www.halcyonwomenshealth.com. I'll see you next time.